In the past, David has done a lot of journalism, and he's been an activist in his youth, a cultural activist, and he's managed a punk band. He's done a lot of really cool stuff. So if you could just join me in welcoming David, and he'll get started.
The street is filled with bloody hand-to-hand combat and choked with tear gas. The night before, October 4th, 1945, at a mass meeting of the Striking Conference of Studio Unions at the Hollywood Legion Stadium, one CSU member had stirred fellow film workers when he stood up to propose, quote, "If we had 1,000 pickets at Warner's in the morning, they couldn't open the studio. Let's do it." At 5 a.m., the first pickets arrive at Warner Brothers Studio in Burbank. By 7 a.m., 750 are on the line. A cop tries to drive through the pickets and his car is overturned. Moments later, 2 scab cars trying to cross are overturned. As morning breaks, there are sporadic fights between strikers and the crowd that has formed across the street. A collection of scabs, mobbed-up toughs, and members of the non-striking IETSE union. The anti-union crowd is bolstered by police from 4 detachments and a riot squad with steel helmets, gas masks, and clubs. The picket line holds. Warner Brothers, as predicted, is shut down. But something that might seem almost inconceivable in the early 21st century is about to break out. Class war in the San Fernando Valley. Anyway, it's good to be occupying Hollywood with you tonight. The section I just read is a tone of the book and also the tone of the, a lot of the politics going on today as well as back then. Now the genesis of this book was my working in the daily press in Canada as a film critic. And anywhere you work as a film critic these days, you can't help but notice after a fairly short while that most of the movies are terrible that you're looking at. And so that was the beginning of the book. Why are the movies so bad these days? And when you start exploring that, just as when you start exploring a lot of things that are going on in this society, you find yourself sooner or later face to face with corporate power. And what I found is that the more corporate the films have become, and the film industry has become, the worse the movies have become. And here's the next quote is from the introduction and talks about that development. Well, English is the studio's language of choice. No language at all is even better when you have a global target audience. So the studios have invented a new kind of silent picture. Computerized effects, car crashes, and other action in place of dialogue, aimed at youthful male moviegoers everywhere. It's no longer unusual for a studio movie to premiere overseas and draw most of its revenues outside North America. Quote, "I found dealing with studios that decisions are made by their international sales department," says Canadian filmmaker Don McKellar. Local culture falls prey to the globalization of culture because to survive, read, expand, and dominate, corporate film, television, music, and publishing require a worldwide audience. While culture corporations like to speak of free flow of information, in their reality that means freedom for their products to reach a global audience without such nagging impediments as local cultures. So its noise drowns out local artists while its film industry benefits from local grants, tax breaks, anti-union legislation, and public financing of new roads and other infrastructure. It's a socialization of corporate costs alongside the privatization of cultural profits. The benefactors of this public largesse pull up stakes when not properly pampered. Besides running roughshod over other countries' filmmakers and cinemas, studio globalization means outsourcing Hollywood to the lowest bidder. Along with dictating which movies are seen, it determines where movies are made. Subsidizing corporate billionaires has become a way of life in today's film world. Besides being nearly impossible to make a good movie within the Hollywood studio system, producers everywhere else make bad imitations of bad American movies. There are so many films that are made in Mexico that just follow this American recipe for making a romantic comedy or an action movie, says Mexican filmmaker Mariana Chinillo. Quote, "Some of them turn out to be box office successes, but most of them don't, and they look alike. They're just Hollywood wannabe films." Says, for France's Catherine Breillat, quote, What it's about is brainwashing, because it leads people to always watch the same thing, to go for series rather than innovation, repetition rather than creation, and sequels, where you see a film and then the second, the third, the fourth. People are always constantly ruminating on the same ideas, ruminating over the same material, like cows ruminating on shit. I mean, there are cases, for example, like studio movies. I mean, the sequels are so convoluted that, for example, I mean, with Star Wars, for example, I think, didn't Part 4 come out 10 years before Part 1? Or Part 2? I mean, you know what I mean? It's just completely convoluted. And the so-called indies or studio indies aren't exempt from a lot of this as well. I mean, the phony indies that are made. I mean, there was Kill Bill, for example, which is actually 1 4-hour movie. And in the old days, they might have, you know, thought of something remarkable, like found an editor. But in this one, they actually split it into 2 movies and tried to sell it twice at the box office as Kill Bill 1 and Kill Bill 2. And talking about the artificiality of all of this is Tom Togillo, who is a great independent filmmaker from New York. And yeah, so he, you know, he's talking about, in this quote, he goes on about how, in fact, so much of what the studios present as arty or independent really isn't. And it's quite timely, actually. This was actually a quote from a couple of years ago, but the reference that he's making here is fairly timely. This is Tom Togillo talking about that. Quote, "The film business has got this cool hit factor to it. Quote, indie cred. What's his name, Christopher Nolan? All the reviews for Batman go, wow, you can really see his indie cred. And I'm sorry, don't fucking confuse the two. Do not tell me that a commercial blockbuster film like Batman has indie cred. Just call it what it is. Quote, wow, he combines the two. That's really smart. You have to be smart in order to survive. You have to play the game. You have to work it. So the smart ones are the ones that adapt and do the Hollywood films. Quote, Batman, yeah, arty. Fuck it. If it's truly independent and truly Hollywood, they should cancel each other out. They should poison each other." Now, what I've been talking about so far is the problems of contemporary Hollywood. But with this book, I interview tons of directors and writers and filmmakers. And to me, the personal story, the idea of the personal and the political and the cultural is all intertwined, and the political history of the world basically is tied in with the filmmaking. And so there's a lot of personal stuff in here as well. And one of the people I interviewed, and this is an interesting little personal anecdote she tells here, is Norma Barsman, who also is sitting in the audience here. And this is a quote from her. On October 31st, Halloween of 1942, I met Ben Barsman at a party at the Rosens, recalls Norma. Bob and Sue Rosen were pillars of the Hollywood left community. Quote, sitting on a fuzzy white chair was a well-tanned guy with a mustache, very handsome, not very tall. We got to talking, and I didn't like the condescending way that Ben had of talking about women when I said I wanted to direct. I kept getting more and more irritated, and by the time we got to the dessert, I was so angry this guy was attractive to me. I plopped a meringue pie on his face. I knew he would call me, even though I knew how angry he was, and he did. He said, I might cook something you like, and I said, quote, can I bring you a dessert? Oh, not a dessert, I'll bring wine. He had a little apartment on Vista, we had dinner, and we went to bed, and we stayed in bed for about 3 weeks. Now, talking about the personal and the political is interesting to me. I think that in the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood was very political, and the actors you know, had come out of the group theater, which is a very politically charged background. And in the 50s, once all of those people were sent into exile or blacklisted, the actors that emerged, the rebel actors of the 50s, primarily the method actors, the focus was less on social rebellion, political rebellion, and more on personal angst, personal rebellion. But what happened in the late 60s and early 70s was the last great period of Hollywood movie making. And that was an interesting combination of the two. Fused the politics of the 30s and 40s with the personal focus of the 50s. And I talk about that in here, and the result was the new Hollywood in LA. And what I talk about here, that combination of the personal and political would result in rebels who, like those in the 1940s, challenged the system, and like those in the 1950s, challenged themselves, arriving full-blown in the late 1960s, when the beat subculture morphed into the much larger hippie movement and James Dean met John Garfield and grew his hair. The overtly countercultural Easy Rider rocked the stodgy studio system in LA. Like the New Yorkers hired for the talkie technology of the 1920s, new Hollywood filmmakers were signed by studios confused by the times and desperate for talent. Not all of these filmmakers were hip culture freaks or even young, but they had a similar anti-authoritarian bent and combined to create the last great era of studio filmmaking. The studios opened the vault to directors they believed might reach Easy Rider's audience. Had these filmmakers been perceived as individual mavericks, without the demographics of the counterculture audience to back them up, studio doors would not have been thrown open to them. But they were. With the discarding of the repressive production code in 1968, which opened studio movies to a new permissiveness, quote, the climate seemed right for a new Hollywood. Like the European auteurs who inspired them, their unpredictable films often combine the raw, the stylish, and the sexual, embracing a libertine attitude that sent shivers through production code loyalists. It was a period of artistic autonomy within the system that would last roughly from The Graduate in 1967 until The Godfather Part II in 1974, running parallel to the height of the hippie movement. Now, bringing it to contemporary times, I started this off talking about how bad the situation was these days and how the studios control screens all over the world. And a lot of what this book is about that, and what happens to local film cultures when your local screens are dominated by a corporate studio system based somewhere else. And so there's a whole positive side to the book as well, which is the resistance of those studio cultures. Against that studio system by those local cultures. And there's all sorts of things, positive things going on around the world. Just for example, and these are areas I get into in the book, in Korea, there's a quota system that was enacted, in which local films, a certain percentage of local films have to be screened in local theaters. And other countries have explored this as well, but in Korea it's been particularly effective and resulted in more than 50% of films being local films. Another director I interviewed, Ken Loach, had another solution, which was nationalization of cinemas. And it might sound kind of far-fetched, but that's actually happened. For example, in Norway, there's community control of most theaters. And so it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility. And probably the largest resistance is taking right now is in the form of digital. Just what's the impact digital technologies have on the world. Like I spoke to John Sayles, the director, who told me when he started making independent movies in the 1980s, there were 30 American independent movies a year being made. Last year there was something like 12,000 submissions to Sundance. So the point being is that the studios are losing control of filmmaking more and more as filmmaking develops. And although they aren't in the same free fall as their music cousins, the major labels, the major studios nonetheless are going through huge difficulties. Their revenues have been falling for years. They've fallen by something like 20% in the last 10 years. Their audience is falling. Now they tend to be aiming at a global audience, and they're just as likely to open a movie in Asia as they are in Hollywood. And they're making fewer movies. Their productions are actually declining. So the studio system and the networks and the entire that form of corporate entertainment is in a huge decline. Like I say, it's not as overt as what's happened with music, but it's still happening. And where it's going, at this point, no one is entirely sure. But we know it's going to result in something completely different in the next few years. And I'm going to close this chat with a quote from Mike Leigh, the great British filmmaker, talking about this. So it's a fine time to be a filmmaker and to challenge studio power. The struggle for independence can seem unending, quote, but on the other hand, says Mike Leigh, the tectonic plates are shifting at a deeper level, because there is no question that in the future people are going to make films and show films and see films in different ways. I like to think, as much as I love big screens and celluloid and all the rest of it, that the Hollywood dinosaur will actually become extinct. Thank you. So, are there any questions? Well, I guess the plan now is take some questions, have a bit of a discussion, and then they'll be selling books in the front and I'll be signing them at the back. So are there any questions?
When you had the fall of communism, the Berlin Wall came down, and I noticed that right after that, a lot of really interesting films started coming out from these countries that were behind the Iron Curtain, like Poland and other countries. Maybe it took about 10, 15 years for that to happen. But it seems that they made some really interesting movies, and good stories, good characters, and just on really small budgets. And do you see anything like that? Is that still continuing from that area, or?
Well, the thing with the Eastern Bloc, the most interesting making coming out of Eastern Europe right now is out of Romania, of all places. And Romania, which has very, very little funding for film, they have hardly any theaters in Romania left. But nonetheless, there's a group called the Romanian New Wave, about a half dozen great young filmmakers, and they make movies on a shoestring, and they win tons of awards every year at Cannes, and they make great movies. And it's an interesting movement, and their roots are in the fall of the Stalinism in Romania, and most of these filmmakers went through that. They were young men and women during that period, and it's a tremendous movement there. It's uneven in Eastern Europe. Some countries are flourishing a lot better than others.
How do you see the internet as affecting the Hollywood studios with the explosion of YouTube and the opening up of to the entire population of avenues to put your film online?
Well, and it's having an enormous effect, I mean, the fact that people can throw their film online like that and can completely avoid the distributor, which was always a huge problem. The distributors almost always made sure that the independent filmmaker themselves made no money. And, the fact that you can do it directly now, I mean, there are problems with it. No one's actually figured out how these people can make a living doing that yet, using the internet. And it's hugely competitive. If you got 10,000 movies being thrown on the internet, if you're one of the ones who's really talented, how do you get anyone to notice your particular film? So there's problems with it, but I would say that digital and the internet right now, overall, if you look at the pros and cons, it's far more pro than con, and that it's the democracy factor is huge, and that the fact that it's opening up access to film. Just for example, I know like 15, 20 years ago, if you had a film class at a university, a film studies class of, say, I don't know, 40 students graduating, maybe one or two might get funding if they were lucky and make a feature. Now pretty much everyone in that class is going to try to make a feature because you can do it for next to nothing. So it's just allowing for way more creativity, and whether it's digital, watching digital movies online, or even setting up digital movie theaters where you can directly just send a disc to somebody rather than having to have expensive prints and distributors and whatnot. All of this is changing filmmaking. So I think, like I say, no one's sure exactly where it's all going, but we all know that we're at this huge crossroads right now for filmmaking, and everything's going to change in the next few years. Another question? Or?
I've got two questions.
Okay.
I'm just curious because I love music. What punk band did you?
They're called the Subhumans.
Oh yeah. Okay.
They were a Canadian punk band, but they played LA a lot.
Yeah,
we did a lot of gigs with X and Black Flag and all those bands.
Right.
We're part of that whole West Coast scene with those bands.
Right. And my second question is, what are maybe 2 or 3 of your favorite indie movies that have come out since the last 10 years?
2 or 3 of my favorite indie movies. Jeez. Well, one of them is a Romanian movie. We're talking about that scene, and it was about a woman arranging and going through an abortion during the latter days of Stalinist Romania. It's called 4 months, 3 weeks, 1 day, I believe. It's a great film, worth checking out. As far as American movies, Me and You and Everyone We Know, I really like Miranda July. Big fan of Miranda July's stuff. There's some good Canadian filmmakers. There's a filmmaker there called Bruce Sweeney. It's really hard to get any of his movies here, but he's probably worth checking out. Great sort of really great interpersonal stories. He has this magic touch for that. So I'm not just, Mike Lee's stuff is always great. I quoted him at the end there, but Mike Happy Go Lucky, I really enjoyed his film. Ken Loach, if you're looking for really overtly socially conscious filmmaking, the British filmmaker, almost anything Ken Loach does is great. There's a lot of other, I like the Mumblecore movement, the American Mumblecore movement. That's a movement of young filmmakers who make American filmmakers who make I talk about them in the book. I interviewed Andrew Bujelski, who's probably the best known of them. And they make American movies primarily about relationship movies, but 21st century movies as opposed to Woody Allen's. About young people in the 21st century and their romantic personal relationships. And they do them on low budget. Most of them are digital, and the thing that's amazing about them is they're just so good, and they're a lot different. We were talking about how do you notice who's good. This particular group of people sort of emerged just the last few years. They met each other at different film festivals, and they became kind of a community. And unlike earlier waves and movements that were based in one city, like the French New Wave was Paris, the New Hollywood was LA, these filmmakers, true to the internet age, there's one of them's in Seattle, there's a woman named Lynn Shelton, one of them's in there's a couple in LA, there's one in Portland, New York. They're scattered around, but they're worth checking out, Joe Swanberg's another one of them. Yeah, it's worth the Mumblecore. So I'd say they're interesting young independent filmmakers.
Thanks.
Other questions? Well,
Have you heard of the Roku box movement? Because I talked to some people that were distributing, and it seems like that might be the solution. And what they do is these companies, the Roku box, which will connect wirelessly your computer, your internet source in your house to your TV, because all the new TVs are all internet ready, all high def. And I talked to some young filmmakers who couldn't ever make a dime. They were just losing so much money, and they decided to go with this company that puts movies on the Roku box. And the trick is the movies are free because, it's supported by ads on the Roku box. So you have to watch a couple of ads, but so what? You're getting a movie for free. And the ads are then, that money is divvied up. And now, like these filmmakers said that they're actually making some money. So they said it's like real small right now, but it could be something big in the future. And they said, who is going to sit at home and order something from Netflix if you've never heard of the people that made the movie, or it's a filmmaker that's unknown, and you look at the thing and well, that's okay, but would you pay $10 for it? Well, no. But if it's free, you might watch it, and then you'd sit through a couple of ads. And that might be the solution to a lot of this.
No, it sounds good.
Yeah,
Definitely,
yeah, it's really interesting.
No, for sure. Any other comments or questions before we wrap this up?
Well, let's give him a round of applause. So thank you again so much for coming. And like David was mentioning, if you haven't bought the book yet, and you should, it's up at the front counter. And then we'll be doing the signing at the back counter, and we'll just have a line right along here. So, yeah, thanks guys.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to get a copy of the book.